I just say a few words about the subject of leadership that Professor Yan raised in his, obviously in his book and also in his comments. I believe that leadership matters, but leadership doesn't matter very much. When you think about theories that explain how the world works, what you have to do is you have to figure out which factors do you think are the most important. And you take those 2 or 3 factors and you put them in the theory. And then you take all the other factors and you leave them on the cutting room floor. Now, I believe, again, that leadership matters, but it just doesn't matter very much. What really matters is the balance of power. And the reason that China and the United States have what are basically antagonistic relations today, and the reason that the United States really has its gun sights on China today, has nothing to do with leadership. Let me qualify that. It has little to do with leadership. Maybe qualify it a bit more. It has very little to do with leadership. And it has a lot to do with a shift in the balance of power. Whether Donald Trump gets reelected or not, in my opinion, doesn't matter much at all for U.S.-China relations. If China continues to grow economically and therefore militarily, the United States will continue to have an antagonistic relationship with China and vice versa, no matter who's in the White House, because leadership doesn't matter that much. Now, the professor pointed out that he thought that Donald Trump mattered in the sense that if you look at Donald Trump's behavior in foreign policy, he has not started any wars, whereas his 3 predecessors, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, all started wars. I think that's absolutely correct. And whatever you think of Donald Trump, I think that's a good thing. The last thing the United States needs at this point in time are more wars. But the question you have to ask yourself is Trump's personality what's responsible for this change? And I would argue a little bit. I would argue that there are 2 other factors that account for what's happened here. First of all, his 3 predecessors operated in a unipolar system where they were free to crusade, where they were free to start these foolish wars. Trump is operating in a multipolar world. It's a different structure. And the incentives for him not to go to war in places like Iraq and to get out of Syria are much greater because he's got to worry about balance of power politics, especially vis-a-vis the Chinese and the Russians. So I would point out to you, Professor Yan, that I think you have to take into account the structural change to account for Trump.
So here, when we're talking about the structure, the impact on the policy makings between China and the US, I would say that this structure, I agree with the professor, will inevitably increase the tension between China and the US. No matter Democrats leaders or the Republicans, like even after Trump, we have the Democrats to take over the White House. The tension between China and the US will increase rather than decrease. That's true. I agree with that. But it doesn't mean that the structure makes the tension increase. Will different president will adopt the same strategy contain China. Even they all agree with the containment, they use a different way to contain China. And for instance, and Trump prefer economic approach instead of a military approach. And Trump prefer the trade war instead of the proxy war. And now you find that during the Cold War, they prefer the proxy war instead of trade war. So from my understanding, come to the strategy. I do not mean the techniques. I mean the grand strategy will be different. So that's what I'm arguing about. The last thing is about the change of international power structure. And the different date time for Obama and Trump to run the United States, only 1 day. So the difference between is only 1 day, right? And Obama handled the power to the Trump. But the change of international configuration or the power structure from the unipolar to the bipolar or multipolar is not 1 day. It takes time. It takes at least, if now most people think that the change of international configuration started from 2010, and when Obama adopted the pivotal strategy. So from 2010 to 2017 is the 7 years. So from my understanding, we cannot argue that, and Trump and policy toward China is driven by the change of the international configuration, because that international configuration are exactly the same like the last 2 years at least of Obama's period. So the change of the international configuration taking time, but the change of the foreign policy toward China by the White House and can be adjusted over 1 day. So that's why I think the leadership is very important.
We have this country called China that's rising, and we have this country called the United States that's been the dominant power. And his argument is that leadership matters. So I want him to tell us what the difference is going to be in Chinese leadership and American leadership, and how this is going to play out in terms of the rise of China.
So from my understanding, if you're talking about the China and the US leaders, I would say they have something they share in terms of strategy. Neither Trump nor Chinese leader and prefer to solve the disputes through war. And from my understanding, both sides at this moment try to shun away from the military solution to their trade war. So that's the common character, and they share. There's also different things. Different thing is that, and that is how much you want to have your nose picked into other countries' domestic politics. That's different. And the U.S. and Trump not that enthusiastic as his aide, but he had to represent the group of people. They have to initiate some conflicts with China in terms of ideology. But China, the strategy is different. China said, okay, we do not want to have an ideological confrontation with you. Even you do that, I try to shun away. I do not want to repeat Soviet Union's strategy and to carry out an ideological confrontation. So you see, there's some similarities and some differences.
I would just say that as I look at China and how it's behaved up to now, and how I think it will behave in the future, I don't see much difference with the United States. I think that China is not a highly ideological state. I want to be very clear. I think if China were a unipole, it would not have behaved like the United States behaved. I hope everybody understands that. If China is a unipole, we're in a unipolar system, and China does not have to worry about the balance of power, much as the United States did not have to worry about the balance of power in 1990. I don't think China would behave as a crusader state, because it's not ideologically driven the way the United States is, okay? But the point is, we're not talking about a unipolar world, a multipolar world. And the question is China going to react to balance of power considerations? must be something about what I'm saying.
Such a coincidence.
Yes, that somebody likes. But no, we're on a serious note, we're in a multipolar world. And I think if you look at how China is behaving, it's behaving just like the United States. In a lot of your writings, you talk about a humane hegemon. And your view is that China is going to be a humane hegemon. In my opinion, there's no such thing as a humane hegemon. Hegemons are basically bullies by definition. The United States is a rough and tough customer. Let's be honest about it. And I think you have to be very careful that you don't end up sounding like an American. You know, the Americans think that we are a benign hegemon. You sometimes talk about China as if it's a humane hegemon. And I really have my doubts about that. And the problem that China faces today, and I think almost all of you would agree, is that the United States is beginning to play rough and tough with China, right? Donald Trump is not fooling around. And even before Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton talked about the pivot to Asia. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how will China, in all likelihood, react to that? And I would argue that China will not behave like a pussycat, that China will play rough and tough in return. And the United States will see everything that China does for defensive purposes as offensive in nature. And everything the United States does for defensive purposes, the Chinese will see as offensive. As many of you know, this is the classic security dilemma. And they'll both be playing rough and tough with each other. And that's why leadership doesn't matter very much.
From the very beginning, I never ruled out the possibility for China to be dragged into war during the process of the rise. And because this process is really long. And it doesn't mean that China becomes a superpower, it means that China implemented the process of the rise. And only China surpassed the US, you can see China implemented the whole process of the rise. So from my understanding, it may take at least another 20 years. So in the next 20 years, no one can guarantee that China will not drag into the war. But I will say, and there's, because of the nuclear weapons, and I don't think that the danger of the direct war between China and the US is very, very much. I think that's very, very slight. The possibility is the proxy war. And that means I think at least at this moment, you cannot rule out the possibility for China to drag into a proxy war, but not direct war.